Hi everyone, and welcome to Introduction to Behavioral Statistics. My name is Tiana Keith, and in today's video we are going to be going over the basics of graphing. So today we are going to talk about the parts of a graph. We are also going to be talking about the mean, median, and mode and how to graph that. And we're also going to be talking about skew, which is basically just another shape to the graph besides the normal curve. Okay, so with that in mind, let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so here we have a basic graph, and for any basic graph, we're going to have two parts. So the first part that we're going to talk about is the y-axis. So the y-axis is the horizontal line of the graph. So this is where your raw scores are going to go. So if you're looking at exam scores, for instance, this is where that data is going to go. The second part of the graph that we're going to talk about is the y-axis, and this is the vertical line of the graph, and frequency is going to go here. So if you are looking at how many exam scores appeared how often, that would be a combination of these two. So for example, if you had 3 exam scores of a score of say 5. So the exam scores would go down here at the bottom. So that would be a score of 5, and you had a frequency of 3. So you saw 3 exam scores that had a score of 5. So that would be this point right here, for example. And one of the ways that I can remember the difference between the X and the Y axis is I used to frequently ask myself, why are there so many numbers and why do we have to graph them all? And so if you think about the shape of the letter Y, the base of the letter is a vertical line, and that is also corresponding to the y-axis because the y-axis is a vertical line. So hopefully that will help you to remember which axis is the x-axis and which one is the y-axis. All right, next, let's look at finding the mean, median, and mode. So the mean out of the 3 is the most difficult one to find, so let's go ahead and work on that one first. So the mean is found by adding up all of the numbers that you have in a set and then dividing them by how many numbers are actually in that set. And the formula for mean is here, and it may look a little complicated, but it is not complicated, I promise. So this symbol here, this backwards E, just basically means the sum of. This X stands for the raw score or scores, and this in value stands for how many numbers you have in a set. So let's go ahead and just do a quick example. So find the mean of the set 1, 3, 5, and 7. So what we're going to do is we're going to add together 1, 3, 5, and 7, and we have 4 numbers in that set. So we're going to take the sum of 1, 3, 5, and 7 and then divide that by 4. So when you add 1, 3, 5, and 7 together, you get 16. When you divide that by 4, you have 4. So our mean for this small example problem is 4. Okay, so next, moving on to the median. So the median is just the number in the middle of a set of numbers. So when you are looking for the median, you first have to put all of the numbers in your set in order. So for our example problem here, we have find the median of the set 2, 10, 4, 6, and 8. So first we put those in order, and then we find the number in the middle. So this number right here is the number in the middle of that set of numbers, so that is 6. So our median for this example is 6. And last, we're going to look at the mode. So the mode is the number that occurs the most. So in our small example that we have here, find the mode of the set 2, 10, 6, 4, 2, 8, and 10. So we're going to do the same process. So we are going to put those numbers in order first, and that's what we have here. And then we are just going to list the numbers that occur the most. So for this set of numbers, we actually have 2 that occur the most. So we have 2 and 10. And so our mode for this problem is going to be 2 and 10. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at an example problem. Find the mean, median, and mode for the following set of numbers and graph your results. Okay, so I have gone ahead and come up with a set of numbers here. All right, so let's get started. Okay, so our first step is going to be to put all of the numbers in that set in order. And I've gone ahead and done that here. Okay, so since that is already done, our next step is to create a frequency table and insert those numbers. And a frequency table is going to look like this. And so you're just going to have 3 columns, and you're going to have the numbers. So that will be the actual number that is in the set. You're going to have frequency, which is going to be how many times that number appears in the set. And then you're going to have a total. And don't worry about that just yet. I will go ahead and explain that in just a second. So what we're going to do is we're just going to plug these numbers in. So we're going to start with 1, and that's going to be right here. And so the frequency of that number 1 is 1. So we only see that number once. So let's go ahead and do the next number. So we have the number 2 here, and we see that number twice. So we're going to put in the number 2 for frequency. And we're just going to continue that process for every single number in that set. So I've gone ahead and done that here. Okay, so the next step is going to be involving our total column. So this total column is what I just briefly mentioned a second ago. So what we're going to do for this is we're going to multiply across. So we're going to take our number here and our frequency and multiply those and put that total here in that column. So we're going to take 1, multiply it by 1, and that is going to give us a total of 1. And we're going to continue that for each number that we have in each box. And I've gone ahead and done that here. Okay, so now that we have multiplied across, our next step is going to be to find the median. So we just need to look at our set of numbers here and find the number that is in the middle. And for this set, our median is 5. So it is, let me see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, so I believe it's this one right here. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 on the left side, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 numbers on the right side. Okay, so that is our median right here of 5. All right, so the next step is to find the mode. So to find our mode, all that we have to do is go back here to our frequency column and look and see which one occurs the most. So it looks like right here we have the highest frequency of 4, and that corresponds with this number here of 5. So that means that our mode for this problem is 5. Okay, so the next step is to find the mean. So to find the mean, what we need to do is we need to add everything in the total column here, and then we are going to also add everything in the frequency column. Do not add them all together, do them separately so that you get 2 separate numbers. So if you look here, it says add everything in the total column. So I've gone ahead and done that, and that gives us a value of 65. And then separately add everything in the frequency column, and that's going to give us a value of 13. So once we have those, we can plug those numbers into our mean equation or mean formula that I showed you in the previous slide. So all that we have to do is plug those numbers. So here's the formula here. We plug those numbers in here, and that means that when we divide 65 by 13, we are going to get a value of 5. So that means that for this problem, our mean is going to be 5. Okay, now on to the fun part, actually graphing the results. Okay, so before we get started, I just want to show you the information that we're going to need to do this over here on the right-hand side. So the number column here, this is going to be our raw score. And then the frequency over here, this is how many times we saw those scores appear. And then down here at the bottom, we have our mean, median, and mode. Okay, so let's get started. So the first step in creating a graph is to plot each point on the graph. So just as a reminder, the raw score goes on the x-axis. So this will be what we find on the x-axis. And then the frequency goes on the y-axis. So these numbers here will be on the y-axis. So let's go ahead and take our first point here. So we have a raw score of 1 and a frequency of 1. So we are going to go down here to the bottom, and we are going to find that value of 1. So since this was our raw score of 1, then we are going to go up till we see the frequency right here of 1, and this is going to be our first graph point right here. And then we are just going going to continue that process. So let's do another one. So we have our raw score here of 2, and then our frequency here of 2. So we have the raw score that's going to be here with this value of 2. Then we are going to go up 2 spots for our frequency, which is right here of 2, and that is going to be our second point. And we are just going to continue this process until each number in both of these columns has a point on our graph. So moving on to the second step. The second step is to connect the points. So I've gone ahead and done that here. So these lines connect all of our points on the graph, and that kind of gives us a shape to our graph and shows us what our data looks like. So the last step is going to be to make note of the shape of our graph. Is it symmetrical? Is it non-symmetrical? And also to plot the mean, median, and mode. So let's start out with plotting the mean, median, and mode. So for this example, the mean, median, and mode are all the same number. So when we plot the mean, median, and mode, it's going to be one line on our graph. However, that is not always the case. So I am going to show you how to plot it if your mean, median, and mode are not the same numbers. So what you're going to do is you're going to start with, let's start with our mean, for example, and we have a mean value of 5, okay? So we're going to go to our number column and see where that value of 5 is. So we have this here, this value here, and then we are going to make note of how much or how often that number occurred. So we have a frequency of 4. So what we're going to do is we're going to plot this value on the x-axis and this value on the y-axis. So what we would do is we would come over here to the x-axis. This is our mean value here of 5. And then when we looked over here, the frequency associated with that number 5 was 4. So then we would go up 1, 2, 3, 4, and this is going to be our point right here for the mean. And so this is what that would look like. So you would just draw a point here and then draw a line straight down, and that kind of shows you where the middle of your graph is. So for this graph, we have a symmetrical shape. It is relatively symmetrical. And what I mean by symmetrical is if we drew a line down the middle of the graph. So say we had this on a piece of paper and we folded it in half right here, right down the middle. If once we folded it in half, how much would our lines overlap? Would it look the same on both sides? So if we folded our graph in half, it would look relatively similar on both sides of the graph. So that means that we have a symmetrical shape to our graph. And you can also look at the mean, median, and mode and where those are on the graph. And if the mean, median, and mode are in relatively the same spot, that also means that you have a symmetrical graph. Okay, so last but not least, let's talk about skew. So skew is basically when you have a set of numbers, and within that set of numbers, you have a few extremely high or extremely low scores. And what those scores are going to do is they're going to change the shape of your curve. And they're also going to change the average. So the mean or the average is going to get pulled towards the tail of that curve. So let's go ahead and take a look at the different types of skew. So first, let's look at negative skew. So in negative skew, you can see that the mean is below the median and the mode. And what that means is that in your set of numbers, you have a few really low scores. So for example, if you were in a class and everyone took an exam and everyone did relatively well, but there were a few students who did really poorly. This is what that would look like on a graph. So let me explain it in a slightly different way to make it hopefully a little bit easier to understand. So with the mode, we know that the mode is the number that we see the most. So say, for example, with that exam, the majority of the students scored relatively well. So the majority of scores are going to be here where that mode is. However, when you have a few that scored really low, it is going to drag that average down. And so the mean is going to become lower because of those low scores. So the tail of that curve is going to get dragged down towards the lower end of the graph. So the opposite of that is a positive skew. So the mode is going to be below the median and the mean. So for example, if you were in a class and everyone in the class took an exam and the majority of the class didn't do so great, but there were a few students who did really well, this is what that curve is going to look like. So for example, again, for the mode, say here, this would be the majority of scores that we see. And even though the majority of those scores are relatively low, the few high scores that we have are dragging that mean up towards that higher end of the curve. And lastly, we can look at normal or no skew. And this is the type of skew that we've been dealing with so far. So this is where the mean, median, and mode are right in the middle. And that basically means that the majority of your scores or numbers are kind of all clustered together at one point, and they're kind of in the middle. So to explain that a little bit better, I've gone ahead and created a little bit of more math for you to look at to put that into another term, so hopefully it is even more easy to understand. So if you look at things, in 5 different perspectives, then hopefully skew will become a little bit easier for you to understand. So if we look at positive skew here, so we have average scores of 76, 77, 75, and 74. Those scores are all relatively clustered close together. And if we throw in a score of 100 and then we find the average for that, when we add all these scores up, we're going to get a value of 402. When we divide that by 5, that shows us as our average score being 80.4. Now, the problem with this is that the majority of our scores aren't at 80.4. So as you can see, it is making the average much higher than it actually is. And if we remove that single high score of 100, that brings our average down to 75.5, which is much closer to these scores here. So 75.5 is a lot closer to 76, 77, 75, and 74 than it is to the that 80.4. So if we look at the negative skew, we can see the same thing. So we once again have our scores, our cluster of scores in the 70s, around 76, 77, 75, and 74, but we have that one score, that extremely low score of 2. And when we come up with the sum, we have 304. We divide that by 5, and that gives us an average of 60.8. So we see the opposite problem. So based on this is telling us that our average score is 60.8, which is not true at all. The majority of our scores are in the 70s, not in the 60s. And once again, we can see when we remove that single low score, it brings our average up to really close to what the normal score is. And lastly, if we look at normal or no skew, all of these scores are clustered together. So they're all right around the same number. And so when we add all of these together, divide them by 5 to find the average, we have an average score of 75.2, which is very true for all of these scores. 75 is very close to 76, 77, 75, 74, and 74. So it is a relatively accurate measure of what types of scores we're actually seeing. All right, so I hope that I didn't overwhelm you with skew, and I hope that the graphing video helped. Thank you for watching.